That's Marty Baron. He doesn't need any introduction from me. You all know his background, having led 3 newsrooms, the Miami Herald, the Washington Post, the Boston Globe, to 17 Pulitzer Prizes over the years. That's a bunch. His portrayal in the Academy Award-winning movie Spotlight has also earned him probably more acclaim than he cared to accept, but all of it incredibly deserved. And on a personal note, I want you to know that his portrayal as the exacting editor in Spotlight is very real. I spent more than a few occasions trundling into his office at the LA Times, explaining why I didn't have a fact that the Orange County Register had in paragraph 320 of their story on the jump
Stories
page.
were too long, obviously.
So I've had it in for him for a long time. No, but we are incredibly grateful for Marty to interrupt an exhausting, what's proved, I'm sure, to be an exhausting book tour for his excellent book, Collision of Power, to join us today on our final meeting for this class of the Paul Miller Fellowship class. So many thanks for joining us today. And before we're going to do this a little bit differently. We're going to do more of a Q&A. And before people jump in on questions about the excellent book, I thought we would launch on a discussion of another piece that he wrote, and many of you, I'm sure, probably saw in the Washington Post, on defending objectivity. And I just want to start by asking, I'll ask the first question, and that is, why is that standard, or why has it become, in your view, so unpopular, as you described it, for our profession to consider and to enforce?
Sure. Well, thanks for having me, Kevin. Appreciate it. And thanks to all of you for having me. I'm all that stands between you and being done with the program. So in any event, I think it's come under attack for a variety of reasons, primarily because I think people have confused what it really means. And I think it's been widely mischaracterized. So people think that objectivity means false equivalence, false balance, neutrality, both sidesism, on the one hand, on the other hand, journalism, all of that. And that is not what it means. That's not what it meant when the idea was first sort of popularized, which was more than 100 years ago. And it doesn't mean that today. If somebody mischaracterizes it, so be it. But the reason that I felt it was important to talk about it is because I think it is an important concept for us and in terms of how we go about our work. I think there's a lot of very, very powerful work that is done by maintaining the standard of objectivity. I think it is the way that we can earn the public trust. I think if we abandon it, we further erode public trust. And I was concerned that it was being mischaracterized. So this concept, I've said this millions of times now, goes back to, was really popularized largely by Walter Lippmann and some other people 100 years ago. For Lippmann, he wrote this little book of essays called Liberty in the News. It's not exactly the easiest reading, but he lays out the idea of objectivity. First, I think it's important to understand what was the context for his doing that. The context for his doing that was that he was very concerned that the press was very much taken in by the propaganda of his era, the propaganda during the Woodrow Wilson administration that had taken the United States into a war that cost millions of lives, that it was an absolute slaughter. So it was not a concept that was designed to accept propaganda. It was a concept designed to counter propaganda. And so I think that's a very important sort of foundational point that needs to be made as we talk about what it is. So his view was that, look, we all have to accept that we all have opinions. We all have preconceptions. We all have limited experiences in our lives. We all have our own biases, and we have to acknowledge that. But it's important that we not let those things get in the way of really looking at the totality of the evidence, the totality of doing what he called for, which was a thorough, comprehensive, rigorous, independent almost scientific, what he hoped would be an almost scientific approach to our work, and not let our own preconceptions get in the way. The idea being that we don't start out with the answers, we actually go looking for those answers. And a recognition that we have a lot of questions that need to be addressed before we really know what our reporting should show. And so that reporting was the idea of getting beyond your preconceptions, getting beyond your own personal experience, getting beyond your own opinions, acknowledging that you have them, of course, because every human being does, and then going out and gathering the evidence, doing it in as objective way as possible, and being thorough, as I said, thorough, comprehensive, rigorous, open-minded, fair, accurate, rigorous, and independent. And it's a pretty simple concept, and that is that we're not going to see things if we come in with a lot of preconceptions, and so we have to be open to the evidence, and so that's why I felt that it was important to talk about it. That's why I felt that it was being mischaracterized, that people had equated it with false equivalence. There's nothing about objectivity that says that you do all that work that I just described and says when you finally are writing your piece or preparing something for broadcast or whatever it might be, that you then go set aside all that work that you've done and pretend that you didn't do it and say that everything is 50-50. There's absolutely nothing about that. But everybody starts even a scientist starts their work with a hypothesis, but then they look at the actual evidence, and if they're honest and honorable about their work, they then tell people what the evidence actually showed. If it turns out that the evidence doesn't, in fact, support their hypothesis, which is often the case, obligated to say so or not to publish anything. And if the evidence does show it, they don't pretend that it doesn't. They say that the evidence does show this, and then they show their work. And so he wanted that that's what Lippmann was looking for, is something akin to that sort of approach. So there's an obligation to be fair to the people we're reporting on, but an obligation also to be fair to the public and tell the people what we've actually found in conducting that thorough, comprehensive, rigorous, independent research. And we can be unflinching about that. We should be unflinching about that. But we also have to recognize that we are often, as journalists, we're often seeing the world through a keyhole. Sometimes we're able to crack the door a bit open and see more of what's really going on. And sometimes, if we're smart and lucky, we can swing the door wide open and see everything. But usually when we're starting out, we know very little. And so I think it's important for us to be impressed with what we don't know, more impressed with what we don't know than with what we know or what we think we know, because often we have misconceptions. So that's where I'm coming from.
How difficult is it, and I don't mean to hog the question, so you guys jump in, but how difficult is that standard to meet when you have a cohort of people like we do have now who disagree on what are undisputed facts?
Well, that's a challenge for the press. It's a challenge for society. We're in a situation in this country, and actually in many countries throughout the world, if not most, where we can't agree on a common set of facts. And we can't even agree on how to establish that something is a fact. But we in our profession should understand how to establish that something is a fact. And we should make sure that we have done a very good job of establishing that something is a fact, rather than assuming that something is a fact. And so that requires us to be rigorous. It doesn't mean we should lay it out there for people. We should show people all of the evidence that we have. You know, if we've got a court document that we're referring to, whether it's a deposition or a court ruling or a piece of evidence or whatever it might be, we have the capacity now online to show people that evidence, take them to the entire document, annotate it. It shows where we got that quote from or that piece of information from, take people to a data set, take people to an audio, take people to a video, show the whole thing, and so that people can listen to it and see that you didn't take it out of context, etc. So to the extent that we can show people and try to establish that something is a fact, that is a challenge for us. We have to confront the reality that society doesn't share a common set of facts, and they won't even necessarily agree on how to establish that something is a fact. But we have to show how we establish that something is a fact. And so that's the challenge. That is a challenge for us.
I'm Brian Metzger with Business Insider. I read your book, and one thing that you talk about kind of towards the end of the book, but don't expand on a whole lot, is this idea of news organizations engaging in litigation when they are the subject of defamation. And so I'm curious if you could talk a little bit more about that, maybe describe like a situation, either hypothetical or real, in which that would be an appropriate response. And also wanted to ask you, because the sense that I get is that you're someone who doesn't like the idea of the media sort of going to war, right? I mean, you talk about, during the Trump era, we're not at war, we're at work. Does engaging in litigation like that sort of, isn't there some sort of tension there between those two things?
Yeah, I think there is a tension between those two things. And so I think we should do it very carefully. We don't do it frequently. But I think I've thought about this a lot, particularly so in the last half dozen years, when those of us in the press have been routinely defamed, where people mischaracterize our work. They've questioned our ethics, our very integrity, and they've made all sorts of false accusations about us. I've been subjected to that. Other people have been subjected to it a lot more than I have. So I feel like that really, people have to realize that, as I say in the book, even though I don't want us to be at war, I also don't want us to be a sitting duck. And I think that we have made ourselves a sitting duck because those who level those kinds of false allegations against us realize that we're not going to do anything about it because we have a basic policy against bringing libel suits or slander suits or anything like that. And so I think they should be disabused of the idea that there won't be any consequences for defamation. And as I mentioned in the book, Charlie Savage at the New York Times, with the help of the New York Times, actually kind of threatened to do that at one point, and he got at least a correction out of it. But it was it was small potatoes in the scheme of things. But it was a sign that we won't just sit here and take it, and I think we shouldn't. I mean, look, in Florida, where DeSantis was trying to make it ever easier to file defamation suits, basically saying if you had an anonymous source that you should be assumed to be non-existent. The people who most opposed that was the right-wing media in Florida, because their business model is to level false charges against individuals, including those of us in the press. And so they fought it, and because the right-wing media is close to the right-wing legislators in the state of Florida, that legislation didn't go through. So I think we should remind them that this goes two ways.
Hi, I'm Matthew Choi. I'm with the Texas Tribune. I was wondering if we could reframe some of the things that you mentioned at your first point. You said that a lot that nowadays objectivity is very much misunderstood, more so. Could we put that in active voice? Who is doing the misunderstanding? Who do you think is the most guilty of doing so, and what have those impacts been looking like?
I think most commonly it's people who simply don't want to abide by that standard. So people who feel that they have strong views, they think they know what's right, they think they have sort of a clear idea of who's right, who's wrong, that sort of thing, and they've been arguing that this standard should be thrown out. I don't think they have a very good replacement for that, and that's one of the other reasons why I brought it up, is because I haven't seen any good replacement. Some people say, okay, well, the standard should be the truth. Well, of course, I believe in the truth, okay? The very first principle when you walk into the Washington Post building is to tell the truth as nearly as it can be ascertained, which recognizes that that's a process, first of all, that is a process, and it's an ongoing process, but that there is such a thing as the truth. But saying tell the truth is not a method. The thing about objectivity is it's considered to be a method by which we go about our work. Telling the truth, that's an objective. That's not a method. So, there have been other standards proposed. Tom Rosenstiel has talked now at the University of Maryland, has talked about open-minded inquiry. And I'm fine if somebody wants to use 3 words to say what one word already described. That's fine with me. But in fact, open-minded inquiry is nice, but it doesn't get at thoroughness, it doesn't get at rigor, it doesn't get at independence, it doesn't get, I mean, it does get at independence, but it doesn't get at a lot of the other qualities that I think objectivity encapsulates. There have been others like fairness, but I mean, being fair doesn't mean that you're being rigorous, and people's definition of what it means to be fair is like, well, I called him for comment. I've been fair. I don't think that gets at the idea of, rigor and thoroughness and comprehensiveness and any of that, or even accuracy, by the way. So I don't think that fairness is a very good standard to use. It is a standard we should be using. It's part of being part of objectivity, but I don't think it's a very good standard. And there have been other standards that have been proposed that I don't think are very helpful either. So happy to address any one you want to bring up. So
if I could specify a bit more, though, I mean, I know in the past you've talked about how some within the ranks of of reporters, oftentimes they themselves have been kind of challenging, or the word you use, misunderstanding, objectivity. Could you specify? Is that more? Do you feel a generational issue? Do you feel that it's a national cultural shift? Do you see that among the ranks of newsroom leaders at other publications? I was just curious to get your kind of diagnostic on that.
Well, I mean, I think, it does, there's a different generational perspective, certainly, and I think it largely results, it's become much more of an issue during the Trump years because so many of the values that probably you hold dear, and I certainly hold dear, have come under assault by Trump and his allies and all of that. So I think people have reacted to that, and they feel like the old tools that we use, the old standards that we use are antiquated and are insufficient to the task of challenging somebody like Trump. And I don't agree with that. The most powerful journalism that I've seen has adhered to those standards. If I look at what Watergate, or I look at the Pentagon Papers, or I look at the work that I was involved in Boston with the Catholic Church, or the work that we did at the Washington Post in holding Trump accountable, which I think was as good as it gets, then I think it was all done according to that standard. Now, it may not have produced the results that people want, but I would also say that it's not true that it hasn't produced any results. As I mentioned in the book, look at what happened in the 2018 election with the House. The Republicans lost the House. Look what happened in the 2020 election, where Trump lost the White House, no matter what he says. Look what happened immediately afterwards as a result of a special election in Georgia, and so the Republicans, lost the Senate. So, or Democrats prevailed in the Senate. So, to argue that it has no impact, I think is just absolutely false. It may not have had as much impact as it's had in the past. I would acknowledge that because no media has the kind of impact that it had in the past. And there's so many factors in an internet era where people are able to find conspiracy theories or crackpot ideas that will reinforce their pre-existing points of view, that it will be very difficult. It's always difficult to break through to everybody. But I don't think that means we break through I don't think it means that we break through to nobody. And I think we break through to quite a large portion of the population. Let me get some more.
Hi, Marty.
Hi, Ariana. How are you?
I'm good. How are you? Good to see you.
Good.
This is kind of, given the state of, and I know that, it's no longer your newsroom to run, but given the state of where the Post is right now, and, we know what's happening with the buyouts and all that stuff, would you have done anything differently when you were still running the newsroom?
I see a camera here. Oh my God. Yeah. I don't know. I'm not sure I want to really pronounce on all that, but look, the reality is that we grew a lot at the Post. When I got there, it was 580 people in the newsroom. I was tasked with, they said, Catherine Weymouth, who was my publisher at the beginning, said, we're going to go easy on you the first year. So I had to cut about 35 people in the newsroom. And the prospect before Jeff Bezos bought us was that we were going to have to cut another 50 people, probably perpetually, because there was no sustainable business model. Fortunately, we turned things around, and people read us. We actually at one point had more traffic than the New York Times. And then our subscriptions really started to grow. A lot of that was because they really liked the fact that we were holding Trump accountable. And they wanted our investigations. They wanted all of that. We didn't prepare adequately, despite my urgings, to prepare for the post-Trump era. And so the Post is paying the price for that, as well as some pretty heavy investment even after I left. So I think the number I saw was that they hired 150 people after I left. And I left in February 2021. So the number of people, layoffs and buyouts and, voluntary or involuntary, whatever, they're always really painful. And I've had to execute them. And that's pretty painful too. By the time I left the Boston Globe, the staff was 40% smaller than the day that I got there. Yet the Boston Globe continues to do a lot of really good work. It's won Pulitzers and all of that. And continues to serve its community. So the Post will be left, as I understand, with 940 people in the newsroom, which is a lot bigger than 580 going down to 545, when I got there. So I think it's important to, as painful as it is and as disruptive and disturbing as it is, I think it's really helpful for people in the newsroom to put things in context and in perspective. And other places have gone through troubles too. So it wasn't that long ago that people were predicting the New York Times was going to go bankrupt. All right. So its stock went from $50 a share to $3.50 a share. It had to get a loan, or basically effectively a loan from Carlos Slim, one of the billionaires based in Mexico, $250 million, as I recall. And people were predicting that it would fail and that BuzzFeed News and Huffington Post would prevail in the internet era. Well, that didn't turn out to be the case. The New York Times turned itself around. It became more digitally oriented, growing out of the now famous innovation report that they did, et cetera. And BuzzFeed News is no more, and Huffington Post is not what it once was. So I think you have to be, a lot of the punditry about our business is frankly way off base. And people are projecting based on 1 or 2 years of performance saying, oh, well, this is what it will be in the future. So I think there's every possibility that the Post can turn itself around and make some, and hope, ideally with Bezos' support, can make some good, important strategic investments and grow again. The New York Times, go back and look. The New York Times had layoffs and buyouts and all of that. And the Post was going, when I got there, the Post had been through years and years of buyouts and layoffs. So it doesn't mean things can't turn around, and I would hope for that, and I would expect that.
Hi, I'm Minnie. I work at Time. You said at the top, basically, objectivity means, putting aside our personal bias and personal views. And I'm curious if you can just share a specific example of a time a reporter successfully put aside their bias and a time they were unable to do that.
Oh, I don't know about, I'm not there in the heads of a lot of these reporters. It can be a scary place, even in my own head. So I'm not sure I can cite specific examples, but I will say, for example, look, when we did the work in Boston on the Catholic Church, a lot of people have opinions about the Catholic Church. Some people went to Catholic schools. Maybe they had a good experience. Maybe they didn't. Maybe they were upset with, the priests or the nuns or whatever it might be. People have opinions about the church's position on abortion, obviously. People have positions on celibacy for priests and maybe notions about, what the consequences of that are. But we set all that aside. That was totally irrelevant to the work that we did. And that should not have influenced anything any more than the fact that people might have been devout Catholics, very loyal to their to the faith and to their parish or a parish priest or whatever it is. All of that, and Boston's a place of a lot of loyalties of that sort. And they needed to set that aside and say, look, let's go look at this and see what the evidence shows. The way that we embarked on that investigation was there was a column just before the day before I started by a great columnist, Pulitzer Prize winning Eileen McNamara, and she had this case of this priest who had abused as many as 80 kids, And the lawyer for the plaintiff said that the cardinal himself was aware of that abuse and yet continually reassigned that priest from parish to parish without telling anybody, thus enabling further abuse. And the church said it's not true, just flatly said it was not true. And so the question I asked there at the first meeting, first of all, we went around the room, nobody mentioned it. It was just like in the movie. So nobody mentioned this, and I brought it up. I was coming from Miami, which is like a feast for news. I was a little worried that there wasn't a lot of news in Boston. And so I had been looking and reading things very closely. And I said, well, what about this? I mean, can't we get beyond the idea of one side saying one thing and the other side saying something else? I mean, that was balance, right? The problem was balance, all right? So the idea was, no, let's actually get at the truth, but let's do it in an objective way. If all the evidence showed that the cardinal wasn't aware of this, fine, we would have had to settle for that. But if the evidence showed that the cardinal was aware of this, and as it turned out that this was the policy and practice of the church, then we were obligated to tell that, and to tell that in a straightforward, direct, unflinching way. And that's what we did, because all of the evidence pointed to that. And so nobody hesitated to tell people the truth, but we also weren't going to let all our preconceptions or whatever our views were of the church or anything like that influence the work that we were doing, whether it happened to be fealty to the church and the faith and all of that, or whether it happened to be some residual resentments that people had about the church for one reason or another. All that was irrelevant. But once we did the work, got to tell people what we found, and we did. And it had a huge impact. It still does.
Hey, I'm James. I'm with Fox. I kind of want to follow up with something that Mario and I was talking about beforehand and sort of get your insight as someone who's been a leader of the news industry. You know, looking towards the future of the news, like specifically with the Post and the New York Times, they've taken the focus of less on being focused on local and really pushing into that direction of international. And I was wondering if you could talk to a little bit about why those decisions are being made. Is it purely economic? Is it purely kind of like looking at that future? Because what we always hear about is, you know, local news is in dire need. Local news is really the focus of what we need to go to. And I was wondering, as someone who's been a leadership position in those ways, that you can talk a little bit about how those decisions are made. And I have one more question after that.
Sure. Well, local news is in dire need. And the reason that it's in dire need is because the economics have been really bad. And so if you're running a company, you tend to move in the direction where the economics are better, rather than where they're bad.
There's somebody like a Jeff Bezos who is coming
Sure.
in and able to invest that type of resources that maybe they didn't have before.
Right, but yeah, I mean, so there are a couple of things that I would say. First of all, he didn't purchase the Post to have it be his personal charity. He's been pretty clear about that. I always told people on the staff I was grateful for that, because if someday he got tired of that charity, we were really screwed. And so that we should use the opportunity of his ownership, his willingness to invest for the long term, strategic ideas. And by the way, we did have 6 straight years of profitability. That we should use that opportunity to develop a sustainable business model. He didn't feel that at the beginning that we could create a sustainable business model out of focusing on local news. And he felt that we had this incredible opportunity to be national and global, where he could see a sustainable business model, because you could charge people a little money and reach a large audience, and thus have a large base of revenue. And here we were based in the nation's capital, place that you could have a national and global institution, news institution. Couldn't ask for a better one. You had to name the Washington Post, which was one that you could leverage to a national and global level. Like, unlike the other places I'd worked, as good as they were, the Boston Globe, the Miami Herald, the Los Angeles Times, just doesn't work so well on the national and global stage. And then it had this history and heritage going back to Watergate, where there were millions of people throughout the country who had never read a word of the Washington Post, but had an idea of the Washington Post as a place that held power to account, that shined a light in dark corners, all that stuff. And so it had a brand that was nationally known and globally known. And so you could work with that. And now we were in a position in the digital era where we didn't have to deliver a physical paper all over the country. So the cost of acquiring an additional reader or an additional subscriber was effectively zero. So as he put it, take the gift. He told us the internet was giving us a gift. We, of course, wondered what that might be. We had no idea, since we had suffered so much from it. But he said, that's the gift, is, national and global distribution. It effectively zero incremental cost. So you suffered, that's true. So take this gift and work with it. And because you also have these other advantages, being in Washington with the Washington Post name and the history that you have. And so, so he's not running it to be a charity that would serve the local community. And one can debate whether he should or shouldn't. That's another matter. But he's trying to create a sustainable business model for the Washington Post in the same way that the New York Times has done. It's not like the New York Times has invested a huge amount in local news. We just saw the whole George Santos thing. I mean, there was a little newspaper there in Queens that had reported something, but it didn't follow up or anything like that. And the New York Times did this after Santos got elected. They weren't covering people who were running for Congress in the New York metro area, and so that is so they've actually reduced their emphasis on the New York metro area in favor of national and global for the very same reasons.
Yeah. And then quick follow-up in terms of the focus in news. Do you see a scenario within your lifetime that the Washington Post does not print a newspaper the way that it's going in terms of focus on digital?
You mean a physical newspaper?
Yeah, a physical newspaper.
Oh yeah, sure, absolutely, I see that. Yeah.
Within your lifetime, at least.
Well, it depends how long I live, but given the actuarial tables, I would say definitely within my lifetime. And I don't think it would be that far off. I mean, people have made predictions about this for some time, and people predicted newspapers would be dead. I mean, there would be no physical newspaper as of today. So I think people move much more slowly. There's a lot of loyalty among older readers to a physical newspaper. They like it for a variety of reasons. I don't receive any physical news product today. I live in the middle of the woods, but I do get the New Yorker comes in the mail, but I didn't ask for it. It comes anyway. I asked for a digital subscription, and I get the physical magazine. So, but other than that, it's all digital for me. So, I think the costs are going to dictate that people and where the revenue is, that it's going to dictate that physical newspapers. I wouldn't be surprised to see them effectively gone by the end of a decade, within a decade from now, and that maybe there'll be a Sunday paper or a Thursday and Sunday paper, and that maybe the Sunday thing will be more like a magazine type product with those more in-depth pieces or special pieces, but not a daily newspaper. And of course, a lot of metropolitan newspapers have already moved in that direction. I was just down in Tampa Bay, which is where I'm from originally, and I was at the Tampa Bay Times talking to the editor there, and they publish twice a week.
Hi there. You mentioned just a while ago BuzzFeed and the Huffington Post and how people were sort of wrong about the trajectories of those companies. And having read your book, you make a number of, at least what I interpreted as being sort of pejorative mentions of Ben Smith and BuzzFeed. And I mean, I'm curious if you, as someone...
I don't know how you came to that conclusion.
I'm curious, as someone who's, I'm more of a traditional newspaper person, having run 3 different organizations, what sorts of critiques in general you have of more digitally native publications that have risen to prominence in the last couple decades?
You mean like Business Insider?
Yeah.
Shouldn't you be changing the name? We just
rebranded, back to Business Insider. I mean, and I'm not offended by that at all.
No, but I'm looking at your card and it only says Insider. I think
know.
You need to correct that.
This was made months ago.
You should write it in. In any event, look, I don't have any problem with news organizations that are fundamentally digital and uniquely digital. Not at all. I think many of them do fantastic work. And as I said, I read all digitally right now. So I don't have any problem with that. So I wouldn't generalize across that any more than I would generalize across physical newspapers or physical magazines as to one's being good or bad or anything like that. So I think you guys are doing a lot of really great work, and it gets better every time I look at it. And and I look at it. I get your emails every single day, maybe more than once a day. So I think there's a lot of good work, and then there's some that I'm not so wild about. And same thing with physical newspapers, where there's some good work, and then others I have some problems with.
I mean, if I could press you just like a little bit, like one of your mentions of Smith and BuzzFeed was like their publishing of the Steele dossier. I mean, do you think that the fact that they were a digital publication where they were subject to these different sort of incentives, like being first and getting digital traffic and those sorts of things, like, do you think that's been sort of corrosive for the industry?
Has it been what?
Corrosive for the industry.
Well, I think we have to be careful. I mean, I think that we always have to stick to our standards, no matter how much traffic or profits can be made from it. I mean, look, there's a business model of polarization in our industry right now. I mean, people are emphasizing that. They're accentuating polarization because it works for them financially. But that doesn't mean I think we should do that. So there are times where you don't publish a story simply because you say it's not the right thing to do, even though you're going to sacrifice traffic. And I don't think you should publish a story simply to generate traffic. You do it because it's journalistically the right thing to do. So, in that instance, I don't think it was the right thing to do. And I think that's been proven. My assessment has been proven correct. It's an incredible weapon in the hands of Donald Trump, that he's been able to conflate the Steele dossier with the entirety of the Russia investigation. And I think we have to be careful with, what people are investigating. I mean, just before I got to Boston, there was the case of 2 Dartmouth professors, the Zantops, who were killed. And the Boston Globe ran a story speculating that the husband was involved in a love affair, and that's why they were killed. And that came straight from cops. Straight from cops. Well, anybody who's covered cops knows that there are a lot of theories going around in the cop shop. Just like we got a lot of... Is that Ben Smith? There are a lot of theories, just like in our newsrooms. We get theorized about this or that, or people say things off the cuff, or they say things they're not right about. We've got all our theories. You have to be careful with those theories, and careful with those investigations, and not to go with things that are, just because that's what the cops are talking about doesn't necessarily mean it's true. And in that instance, it turned out it wasn't true, and the Boston Globe had to run a front page apology.
Hi, I just had a question about kind of what you were talking about in terms of a push to have these news brands more global. It certainly seems like the Times and the Post in kind of recent years have made a lot of investment in, Europe, for instance. And, this is just anecdotal, but it doesn't seem like in Europe, the Times or the Post are particularly associated as, big news brands. If anything, I think, if you go to like a local ski town, you'll see a print copy of Süddeutsche Zeitung and, maybe the Telegraph and maybe the FT. But no one really talks about the Times in terms of like UK political reporting or like French political reporting or Germany. And how much investment do you think is needed to get to that point?
Quite a bit. I mean, if you look at the Times, for example, in the UK, I mean, there's so many other sources of information in the UK. I mean, that, the Times would fall down, I don't know what the number is, but probably 10, 15, something like that, maybe 15. The last numbers that I looked at. So it's very hard to make an impact in another country where you have your own local sources of information. So same thing in Germany. Very prominent media outlets there in German. And while there's so many Germans who speak English, it's not everybody, and it may not be one that they feel comfortable with and reading more about more complicated subjects. So I think it's a huge challenge. You can reach, I think the odds are that you can reach an elite audience. And in a way, I think that's where, that's the market. That would be the market for the Times. That would be the market for the Post. That would be the market. It already is probably the market for the FT as an elite audience, obviously. Same thing with The Economist and publications like that. I mean, it's not really a mass audience that reads The Economist. So I think that would be the natural market for some of the U.S. brands, is to go after an elite audience and say they have something special to offer them. And I think, there are people in all of those countries that do read the Times and the Post and the Wall Street Journal and all of that. So.
And kind of how do you feel about, I don't know, just get the sense that in Europe especially, a lot of news brands have political slants. Like if you think about, just the English speaking world even, like the Telegraph skews conservative in the UK. The Guardian, skews Labour, and it's not to say that they don't do good journalism or they don't do good investigative projects, but there's always struck me that in Europe there seems to be a lot of political leanings with newspapers, whereas in the US there has not. And I guess I'm just curious about maybe why you think that is and kind of how that goes in the future.
Yeah, I'm not sure exactly. I mean, I think it probably does go back to the objectivity argument that has been a dominant one in the US for a long period of time. I also think that in a time where pre-internet, and this would apply to other countries, so I'm not sure exactly why this would be different, but like the networks, we had 3 networks, and they were all trying to reach the largest possible audience, and so in a way they sort of moderated everything so that everybody would appeal to everybody rather than leaning in one direction or another. Well, now it's changing. So yeah, I think that's changed. I think obviously with Fox, with MSNBC, CNN as well, you see that shifting and people saying, their business model is more to lean in one direction or another. Saw it that way. So, it hasn't really, I'm not sure that it's really affected newspapers, places with a newspaper heritage as much, but the reality is that, media consumption is highly polarized anyway. So, the percentage of conservatives that reads the New York Times is in the single digits. Same with the Washington Post. And so people, there are people who will trust the New York Times and the Washington Post, but they will tend to almost certainly be more liberal. And there are people who will trust Fox more, and they almost certainly will be, more conservative or more to the right. So, I don't really consider Trump to be a true conservative in the classic sense of the word. I don't think he's conservative at all, but that's another matter.
I mean, maybe I'm just not being clear. I was like, when you're talking about objectivity, do you see it as at an inherent tension with kind of political leanings for like news brands?
Yeah, I think it is. And there is an inherent tension there. Yeah, absolutely. Because you're being independent. And a lot of times there are people in the public who don't want you to be independent. They want you to take a side. They want to know which side you're on. And I'm not on anybody's side, but the side of the facts and the truth. And sometimes that works against people you're politically aligned with. And so be it.
Hi, I wanted to ask you, you mentioned a while ago that it's just harder to achieve results now. And I'm sure this has something to do with what you were just talking about, but I'm wondering if you can talk through why that is and any ideas or thoughts you have on what would be needed in today's environment with respect to the news, to combat that.
Yeah, well, the reason I think it is because we live in a digital era. There's proliferation of outlets. I wouldn't call them all news outlets, but they present themselves as news outlets. So it's possible for any individual to find an outlet that affirms their pre-existing point of view, or even worse than that, if they believe in some crackpot conspiracy theory. Undoubtedly, there will be somebody out there who tells them that the U.S. never landed somebody on the moon and that the Earth is flat. Or some other problem. I mean, there's always been a strain of anti-intellectualism in this country and a strain of conspiracy thinking. Finally I read the historian Richard Hofstadter's book, The Paranoid Style in American Politics, which, collection of essays really. And look, you can draw almost a straight line between people's concern about fluoridation of the water supply to people's concerns about mandates for people to get vaccinated. I mean, same idea. But now it's a lot easier to find somebody who says, that conspiracy thing, that conspiracy idea, it's true. So even today in this country, I mean, you'll find somewhere between 25 to 35% of the American public will believe any conspiracy theory that you put out there. So the Holocaust, let's say the Holocaust being denied or exaggerated, who was responsible for the attack of 9/11, the 2020 election, vaccines cause autism, whatever it might be. you'll find 25 to 35% of the American public who believe that. So what do we do to combat all of that? I think we have to think in terms of increments rather than trying to reach everybody. So how do we get another 5% to accept the facts, as long as we've done our job appropriately and we can really document that these are the facts, as opposed to our own theories and our own preconceptions. One is that I think we do have to go about our work in an objective way, and I think that doesn't guarantee that we'll win the trust of the public, but I think it does improve the odds that we will, rather than people thinking we are exactly what Steve Bannon said we were, which was the opposition party. The other thing I think we should do is, at least with national publications or even regional publications that are covering their own community, so we need to get out and talk to a lot of people. I mean, everybody. We need to reflect setting aside politics, just what is their life like? What are their struggles? What are their worries? What are their expectations? What are their aspirations? All of that. I highly recommend, Eli Saslow, who was a longtime reporter for the Washington Post and now is at the New York Times. Sad he left, but he does really great work. Go read his pieces. I mean, he did a piece on a shop owner in Arizona who had a sandwich shop and just struggling with now a homeless encampment outside in front of his shop. And he's not commenting on, Eli wasn't making judgments about the homeless or making judgments about the shop owner. He's just observing and describing the struggle of a person who has invested his life savings in a shop that he's seeing go down the tubes because customers aren't coming there anymore. And it's the consequences of having a large homeless population. He's not judging anybody, not prejudging anybody. He's just describing it. And he did an interview with the Times and talking about his perspective on how to go about his work. And I totally agree with him 100%. And I wish more people had that view. So, and he doesn't see himself as an advocate. He sees himself as an observer, an explainer, and a storyteller. And so I think we could do more of that. And then finally, I would mention that we can do more in terms of showing our work. We should almost, if we're assuming that, let's talk about just text-oriented stories, we almost assume that people aren't going to believe a word we say, because the reality is that a lot of people won't believe a word we say. So we can almost heavily, quote, footnote those stories with links. So show people the court documents, show people the data set that we're talking about, show people the video or audio that we're doing. We do that, I would say, episodically these days. We don't do it consistently. And I think we should make it part of our consistent practice that says, you don't believe us? Read the court ruling yourself. You don't believe us? Look at the documentary evidence that was presented in court. You don't believe us? Here, watch the whole video for yourself. And then we'll show you what we're looking at. And you can go watch the whole thing if you want. And just consistently say, all right, you don't believe us? Go look at it. In the same way that a trial lawyer in court, would be talking to a jury and saying, I'm laying out the evidence, piece after piece after piece. And you don't always win everybody on the jury, but that's how you try to persuade them. And so that's how we ought to be doing it, in my view.
I'm Eleanor Mueller. I cover economics for Politico, and I have a selfish question, which is, are there stories on the economy headed into 2024 that you think are not getting covered that should be?
Oh, God. With all the preparation I've had to think about this subject, gosh. I don't know. I mean, I think that, this used to be my field. I was business editor of the LA Times, worked there for 17 years, more than anywhere else. And every time a profile was done of me, they forgot that I worked there. So, tells you something about people's preconceptions. It's like, gee, I didn't realize you worked there more than any other place in your career. So, I'm kind of interested in how economic issues are playing among minority populations, particularly the Latino community. I think that's one of several reasons why many people in the Latino community have started leaning toward Trump. If you're an oil worker, first of all, the Latino community is so diverse in the United States. People come from different. Everybody thinks just because they're speaking Spanish that it's the same culture. It's many different cultures, and And I know, I spent a lot of time on this. I spent a lot of time in Latin America, and I advise a Spanish language media company now. And even they struggle to make sure they really understand the different cultures. But if you're an oil rig worker in Texas, you may be fearful that the Democrats are going to, take your jobs away because of their position on oil. And you can be sure the Republicans are trying to reach them. The same is true for people in other fields. I mean, why did so many people immigrate here? They immigrated for jobs, mostly, safety also, education for their kids, and many people in the Latino community are culturally conservative, either Catholic or evangelical, very culturally conservative, and so very concerned about things. So, I might be exploring sort of the economic underpinnings for people in certain groups, including in the Black community, for leaning toward somebody like Trump. I think that's a significant factor, not the only factor, but a significant factor. So it's just one idea.
Thank you for being our last speaker for this Paul Miller year.
Because you don't want to hear any more like
no.
me. I got it.
No, a personal question for you. I really love Spotlight. I think it's one of the best movies. But are there any other works of pop culture, as far as movies or books or podcasts, anything that you listen to about journalism or about news that you think was done well?
Well, All the President's Men was a pretty good movie. So I recommend that. There were a couple of good journalism movies that I thought were good. I'm sort of forgetting some of the names of these things. Absence of Malice was good from the unseemly underside of our business. I would recommend that. I don't really listen to a lot of media punditry, frankly, about our business. I find a lot of it to be wrong. And a lot of people who are doing it not to really understand the business. And I mean like the business, the dollars and the cents of it. And that they don't really, and then a lot of their sources are people in the newsroom who actually don't know very much about the business. So don't have access to the information about it. So I find it a lot of it that I listen to pretty frustrating in that regard. There are some who are good, but most of it I do my own analysis on it. So I don't know that I have a lot of recommendations there for you.
Surprised you didn't say Anchorman.
Anchorman, yeah. Maybe you have more recommendations, so.
I'll go back. We've got time for one more because he's got a hard stop to get to another appointment.
Hi, I'm Naomi with the Washington Examiner. Just two quick questions. I think we've nibbled around it on the edges, but we're sort of staring down the barrel of another general election that will probably include Trump as a candidate. I mean, other than objectivity, what other advice do you have to reporters covering it? And then my second question is, you've had this storied career that includes the LA Times that we've forgotten, but has there been like a challenging day? Like, what's the most challenging day that you've had in a newsroom, and what did you learn from it?
What do you mean by challenging?
Well, I don't know, when you sort of, were grappling with something, whether it be sort of to publish a story or not publish a story, or maybe to like dealing with a reporter or a source or anything like that.
Okay. Journalistic. So I had a lot of challenges. On the first, I think it's really important to focus on what a second Trump administration would bring to this country. Trump can be incredibly open. He is incredibly open about what he intends to do. So it's the only politician I've heard talk about suspending the Constitution of the United States, even though he took an oath to uphold the Constitution of the United States. He's the only, he talks about openly about weaponizing the government against his political enemies. He suggested that in the 2016 election when he talked about, said lock her up with respect to Hillary Clinton. He talked about, he did that throughout his administration, where he talked about I mean, look, with regard to Bezos trying to increase the postal rates merely as a way of exacting vengeance because of the reporting of the Washington Post, he intervened in the cloud computing contract, $10 billion cloud computing contract, to keep it away from Amazon because of the reporting of the Washington Post, such that people were joking that it didn't cost Bezos $250 million to buy the Post. It cost him $10,250 million to buy the Washington Post. He's talked about bringing treason charges against the then outgoing chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, and most likely he should be executed, what he suggested. He's talked about bringing treason charges against Comcast for its ownership of NBC and MSNBC. He's talked about using the military under the Insurrection Act to suppress what would be entirely legitimate protests in this country. He continues to talk about crushing an independent press. So all of those are, it's not my opinion, those are the definition of authoritarianism, by the way. That is, if you talk about what authoritarianism is, that is it. And so I think it's really important to talk about what he would really do. There's been a lot of good reporting lately along those lines, and I would like to see more of it, because clearly they are making plans, very specific plans for what Trump would do on his very first day in office. So they wouldn't waste any time, and he would install, this has been reported, loyalists in every place and get rid of anybody who's deemed to be disloyal. So I think we need more reporting on. I think we need more reporting on that. In terms of challenges, I mean, there are lots. I mean, obviously, when we decided to publish the documents of Edward Snowden, those were the most highly sensitive documents in the U.S. government. So I had to think long and hard about that. Given that we live in an era of terrorism, and I had been in Boston at the time, those 2 planes that hit the World Trade Center flew out of Boston. The father of one of our reporters, our Moscow correspondent, died in those planes. And I have vivid memories of the memorial service for him. So that was one. But, I remember very much, this is of a very different character, but when I was in Boston, one of the most famous or infamous gangsters was on the loose. He hadn't been found for, I think it was 16 years, Whitey Bulger. I can't remember how many years, so 16. In any event, he was found in Santa Monica with his longtime woman friend. There was a lot of theories that he had been, that the FBI wasn't really looking for him because he was aware of so much corruption in the FBI. And there was a lot of corruption in the FBI, particularly in the Boston office, and particularly with regard to Whitey Bulger. Because he had his own sort of people, basically, there in the FBI. So, we're protecting him. And so the FBI said that at the time that the source was a woman who lived in Iceland, which didn't sound very probable given that he was caught in Santa Monica. So everybody laughed at that. Our competitor was mocking that idea. And we at the Boston Globe, the reporters discovered who the source was. She was a former actress for this series on TV called Remington Steele. So she had lived in LA at one point, and because she lived in Iceland, when it got really cold, she would go with her husband to Santa Monica. And she and Whitey Bulger's woman friend had bonded over their love for cats. So because they would carry their cats on the boardwalk there in Santa Monica, so overlooking the Pacific. So when the FBI finally got around to, instead of just showing Whitey Bulger's picture, they showed her picture. She said, "I know that woman." So that took a long time for the FBI to get around to doing that. So in any event, we found her, we identified her, we went to Reykjavik and tried to interview her. She didn't want to talk. The U.S. attorney in Boston said they didn't want us to publish the name, that she could be at risk, all of that. And we had to decide, and I ultimately had to decide whether we would publish the name or not publish the name. And you don't want somebody to get killed on your account, right? So, but we did think about it. We did decide to publish the name, and And it's because we felt that our story would have no credibility unless we did. To say, oh, we found out who it was, but by the way, we're not going to tell you who it is, that just wasn't going to work. And because there had been all these accusations or suspicions that the FBI had simply made this up, that the story needed to have credibility. And we looked at the risks, and they were, Whitey Bulger had been essentially out of the crime business for a very long period of time, for 16 years, I guess. He didn't have an organization anymore. Some of the people who had been part of that organization had written books with no consequences for them. And we had every indication, good indication, that both he and his woman friend already knew who the source was likely to be, and that we wouldn't be giving him any information that he didn't already have. So we decided to publish. But I have to say I was pretty nervous about it. And our competitor, the Boston Herald, slammed us big time, suggesting we had put our life at risk, and that, I mean, basically they were just trying to get readers to get upset with us. And thankfully nothing happened, and that's a relief. So that's basic. That was one of the most difficult decisions I had to make, because when you're not dealing with issues of politics or whether you're going to get criticized or whether somebody's going to threaten to put you in jail, but when you're dealing with that something you published might put somebody's life at risk, that's a heavy responsibility. And so, and you're trying to do what's right for journalism, but also what's right for that individual. You're trying to weigh those two things. And that was really, for me, that was one of the most difficult. It's not in the book, but it's one of the things.
Well, I'm glad we got it out at the event. Thank you so much. As I said, he's got a hard stop right now, but thank you for
thanks
sharing
a lot.
your time and all of the knowledge.
Thanks. Good luck, everybody.